Hello and good day. Thank you for joining me as I will be presenting to you a historical presentation on the lead up to the formation of Malaysia. This is part 2 of a series of 3 videos and podcasts that will touch on why North Borneo could never achieve real independence in 1963. In this episode, I will be covering the question of forming a Borneo bloc and why that failed as a prelude to the merger and the formation of Malaysia. First of all, I would like to thank Institute Development Studies of Sabah, or IDS, for collaborating with me on this project in 2023. Sifting through the many files and documents for the period between early 1950s and the end of the 1950s, as far as this idea, this concept of forming a union of Borneo territories, or a Borneo bloc as we know it, between Sarawak, Brunei, and North Borneo. Why did it fail? It's important that we take a moment and look at the reasons why all 3 territories decided that the Borneo bloc was simply not going to work by the end of the 1950s. Motivation. Why would any territory be motivated to merge or to form a union? Would it have been mutually beneficial for them to form a union? Did North Borneo have much to share economically to give the other 2 partners in terms of monetary contributions through taxation or royalties from timber or other resources like oil and gas, or even a large pool of working adults in a developed economy who were paying income taxes to support the expenses of administering and developing North Borneo, for example? The answer to this is simply no. We had no capability of being a self-sustained, independent nation in 1959. The realities were North Borneo and Sarawak could not meet the sort of economic output at the time in the early 1950s till the late 1950s, when both territories were dependent to sustain themselves financially and economically, which was the British Colonial government and Crown rule. On their own, there would have been nobody to fund the union, and one suspects we have to ask ourselves the next question: what are the economic benefits of such a union? How would North Borneo or Sarawak have contributed in terms of equal terms to what Brunei could bring to the table in terms of its oil production and its revenue and output, which began to make the Sultanate a wealthy territory as a British protectorate? Now, if we talk about what North Borneo and Sarawak could bring to the table economically at that period of time, there wasn't very much they could offer. We were neither exporting timber in great amounts overseas that generated the sort of royalties that we saw being paid to the state government in the late 1970s and in the 80s and in the 90s, nor had oil been discovered in such large amount like it has today, or in any capacity that was similar to what Brunei was producing in Syria. Sarawak was depending on oil production in Lutong. It wasn't a large facility, but it was sufficient. Sarawak was in a very similar dilemma as North Borneo when it came to its inability at the time to generate royalties and large exports of timber to ensure economic output and parity with what Brunei would have contributed economically as a partner of a union. So, in layman's terms, neither North Borneo nor Sarawak could contribute what Brunei would contribute if they were to form a union. Would it have been mutually beneficial for Brunei to form a union with Sarawak and North Borneo? Based on this, no, which is probably the reason why they decided against forming a union, which leads me to the next point: the same desires. Did the Bruneians towards the end of the 1950s have the same desires and aspirations of participating in this union as with North Borneo and Sarawak? What did the Bruneians stand to gain from such an adventure politically, financially, and socially? Not very much. Brunei did not need North Borneo and Sarawak to maintain or sustain it financially. It was self-sustaining. But Sarawak and North Borneo needed Brunei in order for such a union of a Borneo bloc to work. But in the end, Brunei decided against it because of a number of other reasons. It was guaranteed British protection It also had a sultanate that was very reluctant at the time to give way to some form of a democratic system that would have erased its powers, diminished its powers, the way the Indians had done to all the royal houses in India when India became independent in 1947. All the Indian princes in India at that period of time lost all their powers and positions and became nobodies. So, what benefit would it have brought Brunei to follow Sarawak and North Borneo down the path of independence and then to form this union? There wasn't really much benefit in it. So, the origins of this idea of a union of Borneo territories, where does it actually begin as far as history is concerned? It comes about historically in 1887. A director of the North Borneo Chartered Company by the name of Lord Brassey, had unsuccessfully proposed a scheme by which the British government would merge the Strait settlements with the Borneo territories. That would be North Borneo and possibly Sarawak. So he made a proposal first to Charles Brooke, the Raja of Sarawak at the time, and Charles Brooke had offered him, we believe, £500,000 sterling to purchase North Borneo. This offer was rejected by the board of directors of the Chartered Company, and so Lord Brassey tried to sell North Borneo to the Strait settlements or to encourage a merger between the two, and this, of course, never happened. As a result of this, Brassey resigned his position as a director in the Chartered Company, and so the idea of some form of a merger between the Borneo territories ended at that period of time. In April 1953, a conference was held in Kuching, Sarawak, which was attended by all three Borneo territories. The origins of this meeting relate to the question of an embryo of federation, or the cooperation between all three territories in the interest of economic development and trade. It was proposed for consideration the idea of some form of a federation between the three territories, though a proposal for union does not appear to have been proposed at this juncture. Internal discussions were held amongst senior British government officials on this very question, and the feeling amongst them was that although the Sarawak government was in a somewhat better financial position because of the revenue from oil it was generating in its oil refinery plants in Miri and Lutong, there was still no fundamental difference between the economies of North Borneo and Sarawak. They were essentially almost on par. There did not seem to be a great incentive to unite the two territories unless they could somehow convince Brunei. The general feeling amongst the colonial officers in Brunei and Sarawak in December 1956 was that it was very unlikely any union or a planned Borneo bloc would very unlikely appeal to the Sultan of Brunei or his subjects, simply because it did not make economic sense for them to give up their revenue and their income and their wealth to share with the other two Borneo territories. Moreover, there appeared to be a great unhappiness within Brunei royal house over the loss of its territories, particularly Limbang, which separated Brunei in two, leaving Temburong on its own in between Sarawak. This appeared to still be a very sore point for the Brunei Sultanate, and it may have harmed the trust and relationship between Brunei and Sarawak even up to that point in time. In an intelligence report cited in January 1957, the Colonial Office still believed that the best solution moving forward, if independence was given to all three territories, was for a union of the three Borneo territories. John Baines Johnston, head of the Far Eastern Department of the Colonial Office, made the following comments in a communication. The Colonial Office has been giving serious consideration to the future of the colonies and the protectorate in Borneo, namely North Borneo, Brunei and Sarawak. In the light of progress towards self-government in this area, it was generally thought necessary to look to the future of these territories, even though there was not much internal pressure and demands for self-government or independence from the people of these territories up to this point in time. And so the Colonial Office were inclined to also believe that the most logical future for all three territories was for them to merge into one unit. It was thought that the economic reasons for this would have made this the most logical approach. However, I must come back to the problem with Brunei, and they're looking at their self-interest in such a union. And it would have been very difficult to convince Brunei to join this union. Brunei, even though it was small, with a population of only about 60,000 people in the mid 1950s, had become an extremely wealthy sultanate as a result of increased oil production and its relationship with Shell. Colonial office efforts to even modernize Brunei up to 1957 and to introduce an element of local government leadership, meaning encouraging recruitment and training of local Bruneians to take over local government, was not very successful. The beginnings of an introduction of a more democratic form of government had been resisted by local community leaders, by imams, and even the educated class who preferred Brunei to remain a sultanate. So any suggestion at the local government level made to Bruneians for this prospect of a union of Borneo territories always faced resistance, mainly rising from Brunei's unwillingness to share its wealth and the lack of desire to make progress in self-government. It would appear that Brunei was perfectly content. They were happy to maintain the status quo of rule by a sultanate with protection and administration provided by the British government. On 7th of August 1958, in a top-secret internal memo, the Australian High Commissioner, D.W. McNichol, reported that he had concluded a 2-week visit to Sarawak, Brunei, and North Borneo, and that in his opinion, the real obstacle to a union of colonies in Borneo was the Sultan of Brunei. The Sultan was frightened of too much democracy, which would reduce his authority and diminish his financial resources. It was also during this period of time that colonial officers in Sarawak were discovering the distribution of communist literature, which had been distributed within the Chinese communities in the major towns in Sarawak. Much of this material came from Hong Kong. And so these leaflets had been promoting communism and sought to create instability within the territory. Whilst the belief in 1957 was that the communist threat in Borneo was not serious, it was, however, assumed that this would be the early beginnings of the spread of communism within Borneo. In December 1958, Sir William Goode wrote in a memo that he believed one of the major issues in any union of the Borneo territories was the attitude of the colonial officials in North Borneo, who were opposed to such a union. This was further confirmed by the Attorney General of Sarawak, as he had specifically stated in an internal memo that he thought the colonial officers in North Borneo were extremely reluctant to give any active support towards a political association or a union. Relationships between Brunei and Sarawak also remained poor at the official government level because of the Sultan of Brunei's refusal to have anything to do with Sarawak, and for Sarawak to have anything to do with Brunei due to the recent past of Brunei rule over the coastal regions and the natives of Sarawak, which was still a very unpopular topic even in the late 1950s. Another interesting point that's found in the diplomatic and intelligence documents is opposition to the union of a Borneo bloc, formation of a Borneo bloc, and it comes from the Chinese community in North Borneo. There is a great deal of distrust for some reason between the Chinese community in Sabah at that period of time and the Chinese community in Sarawak, who they felt had too much influence from the Chinese in Singapore, and that there were elements that they were not prepared to accept within the communities. Now, what these specific elements are, or what these specific concerns are not explained in these communications. The community leaders who had been in consultation with the colonial officers of North Borneo and had shared their opinions were of the opinion that the union was simply not a good idea, and that if North Borneo was going to achieve independence, it should achieve independence and proceed independently on its own without any union with any other territories. That was their wish in the late 1950s. And so it would appear that by this period of time, the late 1950s, this idea, this concept of a union or the formation of a Borneo bloc is for the most part dead in the water. Which brings us to the next step of negotiating for decolonization and independence. The people of North Borneo would attain independence and would self-rule North Borneo. In May 1961, when Tunku Abdul Rahman makes a startling announcement to the media in Singapore, which changes everything. And this catches everybody by surprise. And this brings us to the end of episode 2 of a 3-part series on why North Borneo could never achieve real independence in 1963. So, this episode, episode 2, sets the stage for the final episode, episode 3, on the formation of Malaysia. And it raises this important question of how and why North Borneo had no choice but to commit to a merger instead of attaining true independence and self-rule in 1963. Episode 3, I think, will be interesting in that I will be sharing diplomatic and intelligence views and the reaction of North Borneo leaders to this announcement in 1961 about a possible merger which includes Sarawak, Brunei, Singapore, and Malaya, and how opinions change in a very short period of time from being against such a merger to being one in support of a merger. What causes this sudden change? Who made this sudden change in decision making? These are all important aspects we must look at when we try to understand why North Borneo could never achieve real independence in 1963.